You sit before me, not as a passive listener, but as a living question, and the question that your life asks quietly, painfully, insistently is this: why does the rare empath suffer so deeply? And why must they learn to detach in order to survive their own gift? I have watched many souls walk into their own suffering because they believed compassion was an unlimited river flowing from their hearts. But compassion without boundaries is not love, it is disintegration. It is the unconscious dissolving into the unconscious of others until one no longer knows where the self begins and where the other ends. And you, the rare empath, have carried this burden since childhood, often without language to describe it, sensing the moods of others as if they were carved into your bones, absorbing their fears, their anger, their longing, as though they were currents beneath your own skin. Detachment, then, is not coldness. It is not withdrawal from life. It is the reclamation of the frontier of the soul. To detach is to say, I am not the vessel of everyone's unspoken wounds. And I want you to understand this deeply. The boundary you draw is not a wall against the world. It is a membrane of consciousness that allows life to pass through you without devouring you. So many empaths believe that if they stop absorbing the emotions of others, they will lose their compassion, as though compassion were a flame kept alive only by the fuel of pain. But compassion arises from the self, from that deep center where the opposites meet, not from your exhaustion. When I speak of detachment, I am not speaking of the intellectual distance that philosophers enjoy or the cynicism of those who distrust intimacy. I speak of something far more mystical, the ability to see the emotional field before you without being consumed by it. Imagine a dream where you wander through a vast forest of shadows. Each shadow seems familiar, like a memory you once tried to forget, and as you reach out, the shadows cling to you, whispering stories of your past, stories of your parents, your ancestors, your own hidden trauma. This is what life feels like for the rare empath who has not yet learned detachment. Every person becomes a reflection of unresolved inner content. Every room becomes a battlefield of invisible energies. Every conversation, a subtle negotiation between your identity and the unspoken needs of another. You think you are compassionate, but often you are simply overwhelmed. You think you are present, but often you are dissolving into the emotional field of the other. You think you are being loving, but often you are merely reenacting an ancient archetype, the wounded healer, the one who carries the pain of others without recognizing the wound within himself. You have mistaken empathy for fusion, and thus you lose your autonomy in the very act of caring. The empath must detach, because without detachment, compassion becomes martyrdom. And martyrdom is not a noble destiny for the psyche. It is an unconscious sacrifice demanded by the shadow. The shadow, yes, this figure that lives inside every human being, the archetypal bearer of what we repress. For the empath, the shadow often appears as a deep fear of abandonment, a terror of being unwanted, a longing to be indispensable. And so you overgive, overlisten, overfeel. You become the emotional sponge of your environment because somewhere in the labyrinth of the unconscious, you believe that absorbing pain is the price you must pay to be loved. Let us breathe for a moment. Let us feel the subtle trembling of your soul as it realizes this truth. Detachment is a medicine for a wound you did not know you carried. Now imagine another dream. You are standing on the shore of a vast ocean. The waves rush forward, fierce and cold, threatening to pull you under. This ocean is the collective unconscious, the great reservoir of human emotion, and you, standing at the edge, feel every wave as if it were your own grief. But the ocean does not cease with your suffering. It does not quiet itself for the sake of your sensitivity. It continues its eternal rhythm, indifferent, powerful, boundless. This is the world. You live in an ocean of emotional energy, a constant flow of projections, desire, anxieties, illusions. Detach not to escape the ocean, but to stop drowning in it. You were not meant to be pulled into every wave. You were meant to observe the ocean, to sense its depth, to understand its patterns, perhaps even to learn its wisdom, but not to lose your breath within it. Boundaries do not diminish your gift, they refine it. They turn you from a sponge into a mirror, from a victim of emotional contagion into a conscious interpreter of the psyche. And this transformation requires courage because detachment feels like betrayal to the part of you that believes love is proven through suffering. Have you ever noticed how deeply anxious empaths become when they attempt to set boundaries? There is a tightening in the chest, a fear of being misunderstood, a guilt that floods the body. It is as though the psyche whispers, if you stop carrying their pain, they will stop caring for you. But this is an illusion created by the wounded inner child, the one who learned early in life that survival depended on reading the emotions of others, predicting their reactions, soothing their wounds, becoming small enough or quiet enough or compliant enough to avoid chaos. Many empaths were raised by parents who projected their unresolved pain onto their children. Perhaps you were the good child, the reliable one, the emotional caretaker, the one who sensed the family tension before anyone spoke a word, and in the silent theater of childhood, you learned to merge with the emotional needs of the adults around you. This pattern becomes your default response to the world, a merging, a blending, a dissolving. But adulthood demands something different. It asks you to separate, to differentate, to claim your own psychic territory. To detach is to step out of the archetype of the wounded child and into the archetype of the individualized self. But do not think this transition is easy. The unconscious resists all change, especially change that threatens to undo familiar patterns. When you begin to detach, the shadow may rise with fury. You may feel strange, guilty, selfish. You may fear losing relationships that were built upon your emotional servitude. And indeed, some relationships will fall apart. But a relationship that survives only because you allow your boundaries to be violated is not a relationship. It is a psychic contract of mutual unconsciousness. Detachment is the path to consciousness, and consciousness is the path to freedom. Let me give you another image. You are in a dimly lit room, surrounded by mirrors. Each mirror shows a different version of yourself. One mirror shows the empath who overgives. Another shows the empath who hides their pain to protect others. Another shows the empath who absorbs emotions until they collapse under the weight of their own sensitivity. But in the very center of the room, there is a mirror covered by a black cloth. When you lift the cloth, you see something shocking, a version of yourself who is calm, centered, Sovereign. This version does not collapse under the emotions of others. They observe, they understand, but they do not fuse. This is your true self, the one who remains when you detach from all emotional projections. The journey of detachment is the journey of lifting the black cloth again and again until the image beneath it becomes familiar, until the sovereign self becomes not an ideal but a lived reality. And this journey requires that you confront your fear of aloneness, for the empath's deepest terror is not pain, it is separation. But what you call separation is often simply the first breath of authentic individuality. When you detach from the emotional turbulence of others, you do not lose connection. You gain clarity. You begin to sense the true intentions behind the masks people wear. You begin to see the hidden dynamics of your relationships. You begin to feel your own emotions without mistaking them for the emotions of the world. And yes, this clarity may reveal truths you once tried to avoid. You may realize that certain people in your life depended on your lack of boundaries. You may see that your kindness was exploited. You may see that your sensitivity was used as a tool against you. These revelations are painful, but they are necessary. Pain is the doorway to individuation, and the empath must walk through it consciously, not as a victim of others, but as a seeker of truth. In every myth, the hero must leave the village, venture into the forest, confront the shadow, and return transformed. Detachment is your forest. The shadow is your fear of letting go. And the transformation begins when you realize that you cannot save others by drowning with them. You save them by lighting a torch that illuminates the path ahead. You save them by becoming an example of what it means to honor the self without abandoning compassion. And now, I want you to feel this truth not only with your mind, but with the depth of your being. Detachment is a spiritual boundary. It is the architecture of a soul that refuses to be consumed. It is the sacred container that allows your empathy to become wisdom instead of suffering. When you detach, you stop reacting and begin perceiving. You stop absorbing and begin discerning. You stop losing yourself in the emotional storms of others, and begin navigating your own inner waters with conscious authority. This is not the end of your gift, it is the beginning of its mastery. The rare empath, standing at the threshold of detachment, often misunderstands what they are being called to do. Many believe that to detach means to break connection, to silence emotion, to withdraw their essence from the world. But this is a grave misconception, born from the wounds of the past. Detachment is not the disappearance of feeling, it is the refinement of feeling. It is the shift from emotional fusion to conscious perception. It is the moment the inner eye opens and sees that not everything passing through the heart belongs to the heart. Let us linger here, for this is a subtle but profound realization. You have walked through life feeling the pain of others as if it were your own. You have felt heartbreaks that were not yours, anxieties that were not yours, anger that was not yours. You have cried tears that belonged to the emotional bodies of other people, and because these sensations were so vivid, so convincing, you assumed they originated in you. But the empath's sensitivity is not a curse. It is an antenna. It receives signals from many psychic frequencies, and detachment gives you the power to distinguish which signals require your attention and which must simply pass through you like wind through a field of tall grass. You may wonder why this gift was given to you. I tell you, it was not given by chance. It is part of a deeper spiritual architecture, a design woven into your psyche long before you were conscious of it. But every gift carries a test. The empath must learn not only to feel, but to remain conscious while feeling. Without detachment, consciousness becomes submerged under the tides of emotion, and the empath loses their inner center, their own voice, their own destiny. The unconscious knows this, and so it often places the empath in relationships that challenge their boundaries. People who are drawn to empaths are often those who hunger for emotional stability, individuals who have not yet faced their own shadow, who fear their own inner chaos, who seek to merge with anyone who will carry their psychic weight. When such a person encounters an empath, the dynamic becomes almost archetypal. One gives endlessly, the other takes unconsciously, and together they create a silent ritual of emotional imbalance. To detach from this dynamic is to awaken to the truth that you cannot heal another by sacrificing yourself. You cannot soothe the unconscious of another by abandoning your own. And you cannot continue to absorb the emotional storms of others without losing the structure of your own psyche. I once wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But for the empath who has not yet developed boundaries, the reaction is often one-sided. They are transformed, but the other remains unchanged. The empath becomes a container, the absorber, the emotional buffer. Meanwhile, the other continues as they were unaware of the psychic labor being done on their behalf. Detachment breaks this imbalance, it demands that both individuals participate consciously in their own transformation. It prevents the empath from carrying what does not belong to them. It forces the other to confront their own shadow instead of outsourcing it to your sensitivity. And though this may provoke conflict, discomfort, or even separation, it restores integrity to the relationship. For a relationship without boundaries is not intimacy, it is enmeshment. Let me give you another image. Imagine you are holding a clay pot. The pot represents your emotional energy, your psychic structure. If you pour its contents endlessly into the world, hoping to fill the voids of others, eventually the pot becomes empty, and an empty pot cannot nourish, cannot contain, cannot sustain. But if you learn to guard this pot, to fill it consciously, to share from it without emptying it completely, then your presence becomes healing rather than sacrificial. The empaths must detach because their pot, their inner vessel, is sacred. It holds their intuition, their creativity, their dreams, their unconscious wisdom. If it is allowed to leak through boundaryless compassion, the empath loses their connection to the self, the source of their deepest power. Detachment, therefore, is not an act of cold reason, but an act of devotion. Devotion to the self, devotion to truth, devotion to the integrity of your own inner world. This devotion is not selfishness. It is individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, rather than who others unconsciously compel you to be. In dreams, this process often appears as a journey through symbolic landscapes. An empath may dream of carrying heavy bags, each belonging to someone else, or they may dream of rescuing someone drowning, only to find themselves pulled under by the weight of the other's panic, or they may wander through a crowded house, each room filled with people asking for help, company, understanding. These dreams reveal the unconscious patterns of the empath's life. They reveal the psychic truth. You have been carrying too much. One patient once told me a dream in which she was walking through a dark forest carrying a wounded bird. She loved the bird dearly and wanted to nurse it back to life. But the longer she held it, the heavier it became, until eventually she could not lift her arms. And when she finally looked closely, she saw that the bird was not a bird at all, but a shadowy child clinging to her chest. This dream was a revelation. Her compassion had fused with the archetype of the wounded child, not her child, but the child of someone else, someone whose emotional wounds she had unconsciously adopted. When I asked her what she thought the dream meant, she said something profound. I have mistaken someone else's healing for my purpose. This is the plight of the empath without detachment. The empath becomes entangled with wounds that are not theirs, destinies that are not theirs, emotions that are not theirs. Detachment calls the empaths back to their own path. And yet, when the empath first attempts to detach, they often encounter resistance from within. The ego, shaped by years of emotional conditioning, protests, it says, if I stop taking responsibility for others, who will I be? And indeed, this is a terrifying question. You have defined yourself for so long by your capacity to feel, to understand, to absorb, that you fear the emptiness that might remain if you stop. But the emptiness you fear is not emptiness, it is space. Space for your own desires, your own perspective, your own individuality. The empath's identity has often been constructed around the needs of others. Detachment breaks this old identity so that a new one may emerge, an identity rooted not in emotional fusion but in conscious presence. This transformation resembles what alchemists described as the separation phase, where base material is divided so that it may be purified. The empath must separate their emotions from the emotions of others. They must differentiate their unconscious material from the collective unconscious. They must discern where they end and the other begins. Only then can integration occur. Only then can the empath step into true spiritual maturity. And now, let us speak of something rarely discussed, the spiritual nature of boundaries. People often assume boundaries are psychological concepts, rules, decisions, limits, but boundaries have a metaphysical dimension as well. Your emotional field is not merely personal, it is energetic. You radiate a subtle psychic frequency, and certain individuals are drawn to it as moths are drawn to flame. The empath without detachment becomes an open field, an unprotected garden into which all manner of energies may wander. Detachment is the fence around this garden, not to keep the world out, but to prevent the unconscious from devouring your life force. When you detach, you reclaim the right to choose who has access to your inner world. You reclaim your spiritual territory, and in doing so, you awaken a deeper power that has always lived within you, the power of discernment. You begin to sense when someone's words are misaligned with their intentions. You feel the difference between genuine connection and emotional manipulation. You notice when someone approaches you with their shadow, leading the way, hoping you will carry it. And instead of collapsing into their emotional field, you remain grounded in your own. This is the moment the archetype shifts. You move from the wounded healer to the sage, from the absorber to the observer, from the emotional child to the conscious adult. And in this shift, something extraordinary happens. Your empathy becomes stronger, not weaker, because empathy without boundaries is emotional chaos. But empathy with boundaries is psychic clarity. You begin to see others not through the fog of your own exhaustion, but through the sharp, luminous lens of awareness. You understand their wounds without becoming entangled in them. You hear their pain without mistaking it for your purpose. You feel their emotions without losing contact with your own. This is the highest expression of empathy, the ability to feel without drowning, the ability to witness without absorbing, the ability to love without dissolving, And now you may begin to understand why detachment is not merely a psychological skill, but a spiritual imperative. The rare empath must learn to detach because their sensitivity is too powerful to be left unguarded. Without boundaries, their gift becomes self-destructive. But with boundaries, their gift becomes transformative, not only for themselves, but for everyone whose lives they touch. When you detach, you step into the realm of conscious living. You begin to choose where your energy goes. You begin to shape your relationships intentionally. You begin to build a life that reflects your inner truth rather than the projections of others. And this is the beginning of your individuation, the process through which you become the person your soul intended you to be. As you walk deeper into this territory of detachment, you begin to realize that your emotional life has never truly belonged to you alone. You have lived as an instrument played by many unseen hands, family wounds, ancestral trauma, collective fears, projections from strangers, unspoken expectations of lovers, the psychic atmosphere of rooms you step into. And because you were born with a highly porous psyche, you absorbed these influences long before you learned to name them. You believed they were part of your identity. You stitched them into the fabric of your self-image. And so, when I speak to you of detachment, it may feel as though I am asking you to unweave the very threads that hold your life together. But understand this. What is being undone is not your true nature, but the false identity you created in order to survive the emotional storms around you. The empath often grows up in an environment where emotional chaos is the norm. They become the regulator, the harmonizer, the quiet presence that senses danger before it erupts into conflict. They learn early that peace is fragile and must be maintained by their hyper-attunement, and so their sensitivity becomes both their armor and their prison. Detachment is the act of laying down that armor. It is the moment the soul whispers, I no longer need to carry what does not belong to me. But few empaths realize how deeply they are fused with the emotional bodies of others. This fusion becomes a habitual way of relating, a psychic imprint encoded into their unconscious. It leads them to attract people who feed on emotional openness. People who live in a state of internal fragmentation and see the empath as a source of cohesion. I have observed that the rare empath, especially one on a spiritual path, is often targeted not consciously but energetically by individuals who have not yet integrated their own shadow. These people sense the empath's sensitivity as a space where their unresolved emotions can be deposited. They bring their pain, their confusion, their unmet needs, their unexamined fears, and place them at the empath's feet, trusting without ever saying it out loud that the empath will carry them. But you did not incarnate to be a vessel for the emotional refuse of others. You incarnated to become conscious, to illuminate the depths of your own psyche, to awaken your inner authority. And detachment is the first initiation into that authority. In some myths, the hero must undergo a separation phase, a retreat into solitude where they confront their inner monsters. For the empath, those monsters are not demons in the traditional sense. They are the internalized voices of others, the emotional imprints you have carried for years. You may hear them as guilt. You may feel them as anxiety when you set a boundary. You may sense them as a pressure in the chest, a tightening of the throat, a heaviness in the solar plexus. These sensations are the echoes of old emotional contracts. Yes, contracts. For every time you absorbed someone's pain in childhood, you silently agreed to carry it. And such agreements remain in the unconscious until they are confronted. Detachment is the renegotiation of these contracts. It is the turning inward to say, this burden is not mine. I release it. And though this sounds like a simple affirmation, the psychic process is far deeper. The unconscious must be convinced through experience, through symbolic action, through emotional truth. Often the empath's detachment journey is triggered by exhaustion, a physical collapse, a mental breakdown, a sudden awareness that their energy is bleeding out into places where it is not honored. When this moment comes, it is not a failure. It is a message from the self. The self, the organizing principle of your psyche, will not allow you to continue living in fragmentation. It pushes you toward wholeness through whatever means necessary. This may manifest as a dream. Dreams are the language of the unconscious, the stage upon which your inner world acts out what the ego resists. A dream might show you drowning beneath waves you cannot escape, or walking through a house filled with strangers who ask, "Can you help me?" Or wandering through a labyrinth carrying a lantern that grows dimmer with each step. These images are not random. They reveal the state of your psychic boundaries. I recall the dream of a young woman who came to me on the verge of emotional collapse. In her dream, she was standing in a vast field at dusk. One by one, faceless figures approached her, each asking for a piece of her light. Out of kindness, she gave it to them. Eventually, she opened her hands and found that no light remained. She stood in darkness, alone, unable to see even her own outline. When she described this dream, tears filled her eyes. She whispered, "This is how I live. This is how many empaths live, giving away the light within them, believing it is their purpose to illuminate others, never realizing that if the light is extinguished, no one is helped." Detachment then becomes the act of reclaiming your light. The light is not extinguished through giving. It is extinguished through unconscious giving, through giving without boundaries, through giving as a compulsive habit rather than a conscious choice. The unconscious compulsion to give is often rooted in fear, not fear of others, but fear of the inner void. The empath, accustomed to emotional fusion, often equates stillness with emptiness. When nothing is happening, when no one needs them, when no emotional crisis demands their attention, they may feel a strange sense of disorientation. They may feel as though they have lost their purpose. They may even feel unloved. For the empath who has lived as a caretaker, love is associated with usefulness. Detachment is the antidote to this illusion. It teaches the empath that love is not dependent on service, that their worth is not tied to their emotional labor, that their existence does not need justification through the healing of others. This realization is often painful, for it requires the empath to confront the parts of themselves they avoided by focusing outward. The feelings of inadequacy, the fear of rejection, the unresolved childhood wounds, the deep existential question, who am I beyond my sensitivity? And yet, this confrontation is the beginning of liberation. When you detach from others, you attach to yourself. You begin to sense the quiet presence within you that has been guiding you all along. This inner presence is calm, unmoved by external chaos. It is not cold, it is vast. It holds the emotional storms of life the way a mountain holds weather without losing its form. As you step into this inner presence, something extraordinary happens. The world no longer overwhelms you. You still feel deeply, but the feelings do not swallow you whole. You still care, but your caring does not drain you. You still listen, but the pain of others does not echo endlessly in your psyche, because now you listen from a place of centeredness, not fusion. This shift is often accompanied by a change in your dreams. Instead of drowning, you find yourself floating. Instead of carrying others, you find yourself standing alone on solid ground. Instead of wandering through a crowded house, you find yourself in a cleared room, with a door you can open or close at will. This is the symbolic beginning of boundary formation. Do not underestimate the power of symbolic transformation. The psyche communicates through images, and when these images shift, your outer life will follow. Relationships may change. Certain people will pull away when they realize they can no longer feed on your emotional energy. Others will be drawn to your newfound clarity and strength. You may discover that you no longer tolerate behaviors you once excused. You may find yourself speaking truth you once suppressed. You may even feel moments of profound solitude, not loneliness, but solely to the fullness of being with oneself. This solitude is the womb of individuation. It is where you begin to sense the voice of the self, and when you hear it, you will realize that detachment does not disconnect you from others. It connects you more deeply to your own inner world. And only from this inner world can you form authentic relationships. Authentic relationships are not born from fusion. They are born from two individuals standing in their own center, meeting each other consciously. When an empath detaches, they stop trying to rescue others. They begin relating instead of saving. They begin listening instead of absorbing. They begin loving without sacrificing themselves. Yeah. This is not a small shift, it is a psychic rebirth. And yet, this rebirth requires courage, for when you detach from the emotional worlds of others, you must walk through the world without your old identity. You must confront the silence that emerges when you are no longer tuned into the emotional frequency of everyone around you. At first, this silence may feel unsettling, but slowly it reveals something miraculous, the presence of your true self. The self is not fragile. It does not collapse under the emotions of others. It does not fear boundaries. It does not cling to relationships that drain your spirit. It is steady, luminous, Sovereign. When you live from the self, you feel emotions without drowning in them. You love without losing yourself. You sense the invisible world without being swallowed by it. And now you begin to understand what I mean when I say that detachment is the spiritual boundary of the empath. It is the doorway through which you pass from unconscious suffering into conscious existence. It is the moment you stop reacting to the world and begin shaping your place within it. And now, as we move into the deepest chamber of this teaching, I want you to feel the quiet shift occurring inside you. Something in you has begun to untangle the old psychic knots that once pulled you toward emotional fusion are loosening. The wounded child who believed they had to absorb the world in order to deserve love is beginning to rest. The unconscious patterns that shaped your empathy into self-sacrifice are revealing themselves like ancient symbols rising from the depths of a forgotten lake. This is the moment of awakening, not dramatic, not thunderous, but a slow illumination spreading through the corridors of your being. The rare empath must learn to detach because they are not meant to live as a fragment of someone else's emotional life. They are meant to become a whole person, and wholeness requires a descent into the self, a journey inward where the archetypes move, where the shadows breathe, where the ancient myths of your psyche speak their truth. I want to bring you now into a symbolic image, one that has appeared in dreams of countless empaths who stand on the brink of individuation. Imagine a vast temple hidden inside a mountain. The air is cool, heavy with the scent of stone and time. You enter with a lantern in your hand, though its light is soft, wavering, uncertain. At the center of the temple sits a great statue, carved from obsidian. At first, you think the statue is facing away from you, but as you draw closer, you realize something startling. The statue has two faces, one turned outward toward the world, and one turned inward toward the cavern of the mountain. This statue is the archetype of the empath. The outward-facing face represents your sensitivity to the world, your capacity to read others, your ability to sense the invisible currents beneath conversations and gestures. The inward-facing face is your connection to the self, the silent voice that speaks in dreams, the intuition that rises from the depths. But in most empaths, the outward face dominates while the inward face remains hidden, neglected, dim. Detachment is the turning of the statue. It is the slow rotation of your psychic orientation from outward absorption to inward awareness. This rotation does not sever your connection to others, it balances it. For too long, your empathy has flowed outward, like a river without banks, carving away the soil of your identity. Detachment is the building of the banks, the containment of the river, the recognition that your feelings, your thoughts, your presence have a boundary, a shape, a purpose. When you begin to turn inward, you discover that your empathy has an inner counterpart intuition, the knowing that arises from your own soul rather than from the emotions of others. This intuition is the voice you have rarely heard because the noise of the world has always been louder. But now, as you detach, the voice becomes clearer. It whispers truths you have long avoided, that you are exhausted, that certain relationships drain your spirit, that your caretaking has often been a way to avoid your own wounds, that your sensitivity is not a weakness, but a form of perception that must be honored and protected. And as this inner voice strengthens, something else becomes visible. The shadow, the empath shadow, is not malicious. It is simply the part of you that you have repressed in order to maintain harmony. It contains your anger, your longing for independence, your unmet needs, your desire to stop being responsible for everyone's emotional well-being. It contains the parts of you that said no when you forced yourself to say yes. It contains the truth behind the mask of endless compassion. When the empath begins to detach, the shadow rises. It may appear as irritation where you once tolerated chaos. It may appear as sudden clarity where confusion once lived. It may appear as grief for the years you spent absorbing pain that did not belong to you. But the shadow is not your enemy, it is your teacher. It tells you where your boundaries have been violated. It tells you where you need to stop giving. It tells you who you can no longer be. Do not be afraid of this shadow. Welcome it. It is the guardian of your sovereignty. When you integrate it, you gain a power that empaths rarely access, the ability to say no without fear, the ability to remain present without merging, the ability to feel deeply while staying rooted in yourself. This is the metamorphosis of the empath moving from porousness to presence, from unconscious sensitivity to conscious discernment. This transformation often ripples outward into your relationships. People who only valued you for your emotional availability may withdraw, confused by your newfound boundaries. Those who were drawn to your softness may feel threatened by your clarity. Those who relied on your self-abandonment may accuse you of changing, of becoming distant, of losing your compassion. But do not fear this reaction. It reveals something essential. Your former version served their unconscious needs, not your growth. And yet, as these old dynamics fall away, you will attract new ones, individuals who honor your boundaries, souls who see your presence not as a resource to be consumed, but as a light to be respected. People who resonate with your clarity, not your collapse. Relationships founded not on emotional fusion, but on spiritual partnership. This is the reward of detachment. The world begins to mirror your wholeness instead of your wounds. But perhaps the most profound shift occurs within your inner life when you detach. You stop carrying the emotional bodies of others. You stop waking up with heaviness that is not yours. You stop mistaking other people's fear for your intuition. You stop performing the unconscious labor of holding the psychic fragments of everyone around you. Your mind becomes spacious. Your emotions become clean. Your intuition becomes sharp. And beneath this clarity, something extraordinary reveals itself, your own destiny. For empaths often lose sight of their purpose because they are entangled in the purposes of others. Their path becomes blurred by the emotions they carry. Their inner voice becomes drowned out by the noise of the world. But when you detach, your destiny emerges like a figure walking out of fog, slowly, silently, unmistakably. You begin to sense what you are here to do, not as a reaction to others, but as an expression of the self. You feel the stirrings of creative energy that had long been suppressed by emotional exhaustion. You feel a desire to build, to create, to speak, to move, to live from a place of authenticity. And at last, you understand that your sensitivity was never meant to chain you. It was meant to guide you. Detachment reveals the true purpose of your empathy, not to merge with others, but to perceive the truth beneath their masks, not to absorb their pain, but to recognize the structures of their psyche, not to be consumed by the collective unconscious, but to navigate it with awareness. And now, as you stand at the end of this long corridor of understanding, I want to bring you into one final image, a dream I have seen echoed throughout the psyches of empaths in every culture and every era. You stand on a high cliff overlooking a vast landscape. Below you stretch forests, rivers, mountains representing the many emotional worlds you once wandered through without boundaries. The wind is strong, yet it does not push you. It simply surrounds you, reminding you that the world is immense and full of energies that are no longer your responsibility to absorb. In your hand, you hold a lantern, but now it burns brightly, not because others have filled it, but because you have reclaimed the fire that always belonged to you. And as you stand on this cliff, you realize something profound. You do not need to descend into every valley, enter every forest, or cross every river. You can choose where to go. You can choose what to feel. You can choose who is allowed into the inner sanctum of your soul. Choice, this is the true gift of detachment. It turns empathy from a reflex into a mastery. It turns sensitivity from vulnerability into wisdom. It turns the empath from a wounded healer into a conscious one. As you return from this metaphorical cliff, you walk not with the posture of someone carrying the world, but with the grounded presence of someone who belongs to themselves. You sense the subtle boundary around your emotional body, a membrane of light, not impenetrable, but sovereign, You feel connected to others, but not fused, open, but not exposed, compassionate, but not depleted. This is the empath reborn, and now you can finally understand the truth at the heart of this entire journey. Detachment is not the end of empathy. It is the beginning of conscious love, a love that does not sacrifice itself to be worthy, a love that does not drown in the emotions of others, a love that flows from the self, not from fear, a love that sees clearly, feels deeply, and remains whole. You, the rare empath, must learn to detach not because the world is unworthy of your sensitivity, but because your sensitivity is too sacred to be offered without discernment. You must learn to detach because your gift is meant to be wielded consciously, not unconsciously. You must learn to detach because your life, your energy, your destiny belong to you. And only when you claim them can you offer anything true to the world. So stand now at the threshold of your own becoming, feel the quiet fire within you, and let your boundaries rise, not as walls, but as the luminous architecture of a soul that has finally come home to itself.